welcome everyone. It's great. We had a nice social with a good group of us yesterday at Lewitt View Park, and it was a great tour that Britta Herwig gave, and we almost got to throw a Frisbee, so that was kind of fun. We had 2 people show up by bicycle, so that was great to see as well. And it was a nice kickoff to this. So Adina, would you like to offer some words of welcome as well?
No, I'm just really excited. It's I'm so excited to have our newest board members joining us, and we've got a great agenda both for today and tomorrow, and I'm really excited to support you all in your work during the retreat. We have quite a few of our senior managers here with us today. Probably will have less tomorrow, but really excited to get on with the work.
And Bonnie, anything from you as well?
I don't want to take up much space here. I'm really excited about the Healthy Parks, Healthy Portland work that we're doing, because that has been something that we've been wanting to get going for a long time. So we're really super excited to support the Bureau on that. And also just really excited to support the working groups in whatever way we can, so that we can ensure that for this year ahead, we have really good work plans in place, not only for the full board coming out of this, but also for the working groups, so that they can all be really productive. So thanks everybody for taking your time.
Okay. So I'm gonna just reach out with a special welcome to our 6 new board members. So that's Adrian and Ali and Alana and Corbin and Nova and Sabrina. So welcome to the full board. We'll make introductions here shortly. So we wanted to start with a little bit of a check-in and talking about what matters about Parks and Recreation to us. So I'll kick that off. I grew up outside of New Haven, Connecticut, in sort of suburban area just north there. And there wasn't a local park for me as I was growing up as a kid. We played, baseball and football and soccer and street hockey at the local elementary school. But from my bedroom window, I could see the top of a mountain, which was in a state park, Sleeping Giant State Park. So that really became a place of refuge for me to explore and to hike and just have wonderful experiences. And I actually, during college, I had a summer job as a park ranger there. So for me, parks are a place for restoration, for refuge, for play. I was really looking forward to someone wanting to join me playing Frisbee yesterday, because I have to do that at least once a year just to remind myself of what used to be during the days of ultimate Frisbee. But parks have always been really important, and it's great to be in this group of people who are committed to parks as much as we all are, and hoping to make our efforts contribute to Portland Parks being the best version of itself that it can be. So with that, I am going to pass it to Adina.
So I used to joke that everything I did bad first in Prospect Park in Brooklyn, New York. That is true, but it's also where I learned that my love of nature and the outdoors and recreation and wildlife could be a professional career. And so that's what parks mean to me. It became my livelihood, and I'm blessed. Thank you. You want me to pick someone else, Paul, or are you gonna call people?
I'll call people out. Just it'll be easier for me to track that way. So Brooke.
Hi everyone. Yeah, I grew up in a neighborhood where we did have a park nearby, and so yeah, it was always a place to escape to with friends, or just on my own on my bike when I was a kid. That was a thing we did. And yeah, being outside, I think I maybe took it for granted, you know, having that close proximity, and also feeling like these spaces are for me, and as a white person, I felt safe accessing the park. And yeah, I just grew up with a family that enjoyed going outside, camping and hiking. And yeah, I've always really appreciated the spiritual mental health benefits, the fun recreation aspects of parks, community events in parks, and yeah, like everything we talk about at Parks and Recreation, and is what parks mean to me. And working at parks and having this role here, it feels really gratifying and fulfilling to know that I'm contributing to making not just parks, but our community better for everyone, and with the goal in mind to make sure those who don't feel safe or welcome in parks, we're doing what we can to improve that. And yeah, feels good.
Thanks, Brooke. And Bonnie, how about you?
Thanks, Paul. For me, I care about parks because I feel like everybody should have access to those things. I feel like life-saving swim lessons aren't something that a mom should have to get up and replicate her younger days of buying concert tickets to get swim lessons for her kid. To me, it should be a matter of every kid having access to that, everybody having access to the ability to walk in the park, whether it's for respite, whether it's for exercise, whether it's for whatever they need at that moment. And that's what that means to me. I'm lucky enough to be steps from one of our beautiful Portland parks. And I think everybody should be within walking distance of that sort of asset. And so that's why I'm involved. Thank you.
Thanks, Bonnie. And let's go to Kenya.
Wow, that's a tough question for me. Parks. I didn't grow up around parks. I didn't have parks in my neighborhood because everybody lived on 10 or plus acres. So the concept of parks and my appreciation for parks probably grew. You know, in my late teens, early 20s, when I lived in Savannah, Georgia, and I think it switched to the appreciation of public squares and understanding, you know, the significance of squares and how, you know, you can come together as a community in a public space. So I really have appreciated not only parks, but also the square, and thinking about how we use that for so many different things.
Thanks, Kenya. And Casey.
So like Kenya, I didn't really grow up with park. I grew up in the West Hills of Los Angeles, and my open area basically was trespassing on other people's property. And I really didn't get to appreciate parks until I came to Portland, which is a great introduction because we have these itty bitty bitty parks, and then we have these massive parks. And you know, to me, after seeing all these and how interesting they are, and how each is individual, they all seem to offer the same, which is peace and play, nature and opportunity, and options. And Ledwith was a wonderful place to go yesterday because I'd never seen it, and it had all those things. It had nature and places where you could have solitude. Had a lot of opportunities for different fun things. And it was a prime example of how great the parks in Portland are.
Thanks, Casey. Let's next go to Tim.
Thank you, Paul. also grew up in a place without many parks, and so don't have the kind of youthful experience. When I came to Portland, I was in my work around affordable housing and helping people transition from homelessness, and had been with an organization that had helped develop a building within New Columbia with the Housing Authority. And when there had been some violence that occurred over at McCoy Park, which is kind of the heart of New Columbia, was just really blown away about how that open space was where the community were able to take their neighborhood back, and were able to go out and show that they weren't gonna hide away, and that they weren't gonna shy away from the violence. And it was just a powerful moment as folks in a redeveloped, what used to be public housing and was a redeveloped community, really embraced McCoy and used it as a place to come together. So it was a powerful experience as a new Portlander.
Thanks, Tim. How about Mike Elliott?
Yeah, so I think as Brooke and others have said, we're going to be repeating some themes here. But growing up, I find it interesting to hear about everybody's experiences growing up. I lived a lot of places growing up. And in my early teens, I lived in Brussels, Belgium for 3 years. And Brussels has all these great, like a lot of European cities, great city parks. And all of my fellow American classmates from a small school I went to, we would all take buses from all over the city and meet at the parks when we wanted to get together. And so I think about that. I think about it as a kind of a sense of community and bringing people together to enjoy outdoor space together. And in a big city, that's very important. From a Portland perspective, I think about nature. And Paul, you mentioned restoration. I think that's very important. We've seen that in the last year. So those are kind of the ways I think about parks.
Thanks, Mike. I'm next going to tap one of our new board members, Adrian.
Sorry about that. I was on mute. Yes, so I was a little bit similar to Adina in that I grew up in New York and I lived next to a big urban, fairly naturalized park, Croche Run Park. And although in many ways I was living in a cement jungle, and I became interested in walking and biking in part due to that. And so began to sort of explore all the parks in New York as I became a swimmer. And then when I moved to Portland, got really engaged in swimming and parks here. For me, it's not only about life saving, but it's also about quality of life and living life to its fullest. And so as part of my life, activity and recreation, I think has led to my productivity, my creativity, and my health. And so I think it's critical to figure out ways to give that to our entire community.
Thank you. Let's go to Erin next.
Hi, everybody. So I grew up in Portland. So I learned how to swim at parks facilities. I took tennis as a child at the tennis center. I played there as an adult as well. And grew up going, doing all kinds of different things in parks. I have young children now, so I've again been completely immersed, although not recently, obviously, in recreation programming for children. And I've thought a lot during these, I'm working from home like so many, and I have my children here with me. We still don't have childcare. And we're lucky that we have outdoor space here, but for people that don't have outdoor space readily available, parks are just so essential. I mean, even for us here, we're often going to parks almost daily for mental health, for exercise, physical health, et cetera. And so, accessibility to parks and by the way, since I was a kid, now we have these amazing parks. We had amazing parks then, but oh my gosh, like what a joy it is we went not long ago to Creston Park, which just opened, I think a few months ago, it wasn't that long ago, with their new play structures and whatnot. And oh, it's just so wonderful to watch all the kids with their little masks, you know, hopefully going on some of the play equipment that they have now is just so great for kids. So and then all of the nature and, you know, the trees and the plants, like Westmoreland Park is just a beautiful example of wildlife, where you can go and see wildlife and just be in enjoy that space and that environment, which isn't always accessible in where we're living our days. So yeah, that's probably enough.
Thank you, Aaron. And Corbin, I'd like to hear from you next.
Well, I grew up in Silver Spring, Maryland, and the Montgomery County Recreation Center was like the center of our community. It's where we had all our festivals, and it was where I did my homework after school. It's where my father taught tennis, and all this program was free to me, even though I was a low income kid. And to boot, I had access to Rock Creek Park, one of the largest urban parks in the United States. And so I had like the rough and tumble, you know, play in the creek and skip rocks sort of experience and ride our bikes around and discover things, as well as a lot of these sort of smaller parks that we can go to. And I think the ability to have access to that was like foundational to me and my friends growing up. We didn't hear a lot of no. We got to spend summers together during summer camp, and it was so affordable and it was free for a lot of us. And it really made our neighborhood really pleasant and really connected the ties to our community. So I was very lucky growing up in that neighborhood, but moving to Oakland and seeing how different access was there really galvanized my my volunteering and my research around race, class, and access to green space. So I'll leave it there.
Thank you, Corbin. Allie, let's hear from you next.
Yeah, I grew up really with parks having two great purposes. One was looking for wildlife. Creeks and ponds were my favorite spaces on the planet. And then recreation, so playing softball and sports with friends at local parks and as part of school. So, and then my mom was our nature guide, you know, going to Rye Marshlands in New York to watch the mating of the horseshoe crabs. Like the number of memories I have of just early connection to nature is huge. And then my relationships with parks changed dramatically. I became disabled at 25 and needed a wheelchair for most things. I'm only an occasional wheelchair user now, but and my access to all of the parks that I had loved was gone. So it felt very much like being cut off from nature completely, as all the places I had previously gone were no longer an option for me. So now I've got a lot more access, which is great, and have figured out a lot more sort of access paths, but I'm still very conscious of the ways in which green spaces aren't accessible, not just for folks with disabilities, but for, you know, marginalized communities in general, whether that's, you know, encountering a swastika and graffiti in your park or whatever it happens to be. But there's lots of ways these community spaces can both be so empowering and wonderful and can also just knock the breath out of you in a second. So, yeah.
Thank you, Allie. Alejandro.
Thanks, Paul. Yeah, so I grew up in Santiago, Chile, where things have gotten better, but at least when I was a kid, the park system wasn't very strong. So I think I spent most of my time just like playing in the street, really. with time, and even though I was always inclined to nature and recreating outdoors, I feel like I really got invested in parks and particularly in visiting parks and passion about it was when moving to the US, first in Oregon, first in Eugene, and then in Portland, where parks really felt like a safe place where I can go and I didn't really need to know anyone, where there's no price of admission, where the cultural gap really wasn't that overwhelming. It really became sort of like, again, a safe place for me to like slowly and steadily become part of the local community. So I can only hope that the work that I'm doing professionally and through sport can also facilitate that experience for our folks in the community.
Thank you, Alejandro. David.
Thanks, Paul. Portland parks have a huge place in my heart after living here for 20 years and raising my two daughters here in my family, and they're a super key ingredient into my family's quality of life right now. My daughters learned how to swim at Mount Scott and Selwood. They learned how to ride their bike at Berkeley Park, learned how to play soccer, in Portland parks, and they even went sledding in public park, Portland parks. And the majority of the birthday parties that we went to as kids were in the public parks. And then individually, I spend most of my time recreating now in Portland parks, whether it's Powell Butte or Mount Tabor, Council Crest, PIR, doing bike races and bike rides throughout the city. And I counted it up one day that I actually ride through or adjacent to 6 parks on my way to work every day. So again, they're so close to my heart, being, here in Portland now for 20 years and such a huge place in my family's quality of life.
Thanks, David. That's a great story about 6 parks on your way to work on your bike. Thank you. Sabrina, let's hear from you.
Hello, everyone. My allergies are really bad today, so just bear with me. I'm trying to survive here. But yeah, Sabrina Wilson, in terms of parks, for me, it's really kind of basic, but encompasses so much. I think about space, for exercising, for your mental health, space to connect with your community, connect with yourself, your family, to explore, to create. And I think that's what's so important. But having had the opportunity to work at parks in a community facing role, I really also got to broaden my view of that, recognizing that, people have many different experiences, whether they be, positive or negative or just different, based on your culture or your geographic place and what you're used to of your park and what your expectations are, and even recreation. So yeah, also, in terms of like my connection and things with parks is really just all the community members that I continue to work with, and recognizing that it varies. And so I want to continue to learn and advocate. So.
Thank you, Sabrina. Nova, let's hear from you.
Hi there. It's been really nice to hear from everyone about their relationship and passion around parks and park access. I know for me, it was a refuge, a place to go. When I was a child, I played Little League softball on fields, and I still remember all the fields that I would either take the bus to, the TriMet bus to go to practice. I remember it was a Brooklyn Park over on Powell, where my coach asked me to be a catcher for the first time, and I thought I had been bestowed this great mantle of leadership. I had no idea that nobody actually wanted to play catcher, but I thought it was an honor, and played it till high school. So I think that there's something about the need for parks to be accessible and available to children, because I believe that play is a safety net for children. Whatever their background and experiences are, play is a safety net. I just found out that Kenya was a catcher also, which makes me really excited. Catchers seem to understand each other. Thank you for sharing that. But
and Director Long.
Oh, and Director Long? Oh, yeah. All right. Yes, catchers become leaders. We can't help ourselves. We have to be involved in all the plays. But I just see our park system as a way to provide children with a place to explore who they are and who they want to be out in the world. And definitely there are experiences that folks have in the parks that also are negative, but I think that it is seems like the charge of our city and our board and the Bureau to make sure that our parks are as accessible and safe for everyone in the community as possible.
Thank you, Nova. Let's turn it over to Ilana.
Great, thanks so much, Paul. So I grew up in state parks in California. My mom was a state park ranger. We actually lived in a park until my younger sister was born, and the park housing was too small. But I also spent most of my childhood in a town that didn't have a playground until I was in probably junior high or high school, but for at the elementary school. There was kind of an open field space that when I was an older kid, they turned into what we would recognize as an urban park with a playground and manicured lawns and things like that. But when I was a kid, if you wanted to play on a playground, you went to the next town over, or if school was out, you went to the school. So I had very different experiences with open space parks being really accessible, but without that kind of community playground space that a lot of people have. I think at their best, parks are one of our societal equalizers. They make sure everybody has a space to gather, regardless of the size of your house, yard, property. And they also make sure everybody has a space to retreat to, regardless of your home or housing or personal situations. They can provide first places of employment where you don't have to have a connection or somebody who your family knows. Our parks hire so many people in the summer, so many youth. And they can provide a place for all kids to have extracurriculars and other experiences that they might not be able to have. And I hope that I can be part of helping to make sure that Portland City Parks continue to be the best that parks can be, and that we continue down the path toward making sure that we have that space for everybody in our city, and that we have that space nearby for everybody in our city, so that it really can be a place to gather or a place to get away, no matter what part of the city you live in.
Thank you, Ilana. Randy, let's hear from you.
Sorry, I'm kind of having a little bit of a coughing fit, but I'll do my best here. I'm Randy Gregg. I'm the executive director of the Portland Parks Foundation, and I grew up in Reno, and my childhood memories of parks were mostly this kind of armpit of a park that my dad would take me to when we were going to have a serious conversation. And we would walk around this little lake, so that was a really distinct, space to be in with all the ducks and stuff going on. As I learned that various things he wanted to tell me, facts of life, that I was adopted, things like that. So kind of early poignant memories. I'd say my real entry into thinking about parks beyond the personal was really in Seattle, where I came of age in the 80s, and during an incredibly interesting and progressive period of public art and design teams creating public spaces and public parks, such as Sandpoint or Gasworks Park. I got to know Rich Haig, who designed that in my early days in Seattle. And so I think parks really became sort of equated in my mind with civic ambition. And then when I moved to Portland, I was writing about architecture and urban planning as the Pearl District was taking shape, and part of that big development deal, because that was all empty space, old industrial yards, was the plan to basically build 3 parks as a cornerstone of the development. For those of you who don't know it, there was sort of, they could have built that space out probably more profitably for the developers if they had just done townhouses, through there. But the city cut a deal with the developers that if they took down a viaduct, the developers would build to an increased density. If they built a streetcar, increased density further. And then the three parks were even more, density in that neighborhood. And, watch those parks and how they became, the cornerstone of a, completely new urban neighborhood, the likes of which hadn't really been done in the country at that time. And then echoing Kenya, I've always been interested in public squares, and played a lot of roles with Pioneer Courthouse Square, curating there and being on their board, and then also working on the restoration project for the Halpern fountains in South Downtown. So all of which I think in that kind of theme of urban ambition has been my main window on parks.
Thank you, Randy. Todd, why don't you go next for us?
Hi, everybody. My personal story with parks started in Wisconsin. I had Herb Park down the street, learned to swim there, learned to play basketball there. We'd cross-country ski in the winter. And really kind of throughout my life, I've always gone to parks wherever I've lived, whether it's Washington, D.C., Rock Creek Park, I heard, and Tacoma Park, Maryland, or Arizona, different places I've lived. And so parks has always just been a part of my life where I go find community or recreation or nature, a lot of things. My first job was at parks as a soccer referee. So for me, it's just kind of in and out of my life, whether it's with my friends and family or community. So I just hope everyone gets that opportunity if they choose to have it. So that's, I guess, my story.
Thanks for sharing your story, Todd. Tanya, let's hear from you.
Trying to unmute. So yeah, a lot of resonance with what's been shared so far. I grew up in Ohio, and in a small city, but we had woods behind our house, and of the generation where my mom would basically kick us out of the house every day and say, go play outside until it's dark. So spent a lot of time out in the woods, and the park system was small, but mostly provided a lot of opportunity for sports, tennis and softball, baseball, and I remember going to summer camp in the summer, and that was nice. My mom was a single mom, and that helped her out. And then also for family reunions, and so that was sort of early experiences with parks, and it's always been really important value of mine to support parks and be near parks in my own parenthood. And all the housing selections I've had in Portland have been making sure there's close proximity to open space or parks. And so I really value that, and spend obviously professionally a lot of time thinking about parks, and then personally frequently just in the course of my life visit anywhere from 5 to 8 parks per week just in the course of how we're living in Portland. So tremendous value from individual perspective and also a community perspective, and really see parks and open space as essential to quality of life and social, mental, physical well-being.
Thank you, Tanya. Let's next hear from Lauren.
Thanks, Paul. Tanya, what Tanya said exactly. So to me, parks are just pure joy. I'd love to be outside. I'd love to be healthy. I think of happiness when I'm in a park and enjoy natural areas and exercising, etc. As a kid, we didn't really have parks actually in the little village that we lived in. But when I started working, I began working for a city park system. So that's how I started to appreciate what parks could bring to people when I started designing and constructing them. And so moved then when I had kids to a community that had parks on purpose, and took them almost every day when they were little to the park somehow down the street. So that's my story.
Thanks, Lauren. Let's next hear from Claudio.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, I grew up in Manhattan in a pretty parks deficient area. In fact, in the late 70s, early 80s, there weren't a lot of great parks anywhere near me to go. And so I just actually don't even remember being in parks until probably middle school when I started going an hour to get to the school that I was going to. And I remember all the kids that, that went there, they all lived nearby, and they all lived near Central Park. And we'd go to Central Park after school, and then I'd get back on the bus and head home for an hour. So, really for me, being able to raise my kids here close to so many awesome parks has been, huge. Right now, I think that both my kids are in parks at this very moment after their last day of school, just moving around. So sort of when I think back on the neighborhood that I grew up in, and how it's changed over the years, and how it's actually the parks access has grown. It really gives me a huge appreciation for parks professionals, because and this maybe will only mean something to Adina, but like East River Park was like 2 blocks away from me, but it wasn't a park back then. Madison Square Park, nobody was going to go there in late 70s, early 80s. And they're all amazing spaces now. So it's just, it's been an amazing transformation, and it's all because of people that care a lot about the spaces. But I'd be remiss to say that there's one place that was Parks and Recreation that we got to go to as kids, which was Astor Levy, and that's where I learned to swim. It was a community center about 4 blocks from where I lived, and you had to pay a dime to get in, and that's where I learned to swim. So it's a little bit of a different experience. So I want to shout out for the recreation folks.
Thank you, Claudio. And so I'm going to ask Patty to take us home. And then what we're going to do, we're going to skip on deck, and we'll start them as soon as we can. And we'll tack on the working together piece at the end. So Patty, take us home.
Thank you, Paul. Well, in sharp contrast to Claudio, I grew up in the Highlands of Scotland, and walking out of the back door, it was mountains and wilderness for as far as a small boy could bicycle or walk in a day. So from the very beginning, I was immersed in nature, and it was important for us to understand the names and the habits of the plants and the animals and so forth. So when I became an architect and an urbanist, I carried that with me, and green infrastructure has always been absolutely integral to all that I've done. And of course, that's exactly what parks are, the parks and the connecting spaces. And I think a great deal about the connecting spaces, the tree canopies and the other things that really unite all of the open spaces and the wild spaces we have. And so that's really my experience, and those are my values.
Thank you, Patty. I really enjoyed hearing everyone's stories, and it's, I wish we could have gone longer, but it was great to hear all these stories. Look forward to learning more stories as we grow together as a board. And now I'm going to turn it over to Adina to introduce the team that's presenting Healthy Parks, Healthy.
Great, thank you, Paul. Good afternoon, everyone. And again, thank you for giving us time on your retreat agenda to continue our conversation about the Healthy Parks, Healthy Portland framework For those of you who are new today, Kenya Williams, the Bureau's Equity and Inclusion Manager, and I are championing this effort. We're excited to talk about how we're centering racial equity and underserved communities in our process. And, excuse me, and we're excited to get some additional feedback from you today. Joining Kenya and me today is Melissa Arnold, our new Community Engagement Manager, and Stephanie Joya and Catherine Jarrell, our partners from Future Work Design. They will help us present today, and they'll be using a survey tool to capture your feedback during this meeting. So let's take a quick look at the agenda. First, we're going to have a very brief look at the Healthy Parks, Healthy Portland framework and recent progress. Then Stephanie will walk us through some updates we've made to our Portland Parks and Recreation community graphic based on your feedback and input from other folks. Melissa will be giving an update on listening and learning and asking for your input. And then Catherine will lead us through an exercise to get your feedback on what it might mean to build an equitable parks and recreation system in the short and long term. So let's get started. By now, you're familiar with the Healthy Parks, Healthy Portland framework, so I'm not going to spend too much time here. I just want to remind us of what we're setting up, that it's meant to be a cyclical process that goes on forever, and that this process will center Black people, Indigenous people, people of color, refugees and immigrants, people experiencing poverty, people living with disabilities, youth, and older adults in this important work. Over time, this framework will transform the way we work by centering our values and engaging community in deciding about the services we provide. For new Parks board members joining us today, we are planning to use some time at our orientation in the summer to give you a thorough overview and update about Healthy Parks, Healthy Portland, but I'm pretty sure you'll be able to follow along today. The framework calls for assembling 4 work teams. 2 are currently active, our listening and learning team and decision-making tool team. They've both been meeting for the last several weeks. The listening and learning team is refining community listening plans, and the decision-making tool team is working on a prototype tool to help with allocating budget resources for the fall budget monitoring process that will happen this fall. We are considering this as a pilot that will be refined for use in our fiscal year 22-23 requested budget in January. 2 additional teams, the vision, mission, values, and equity statement team and the actions and results team will be scoped and convened later in the summer. In addition, we've been holding internal and external listening sessions. Melissa will walk you through our progress and plans in just a few moments. There are many other projects related to Healthy Parks, Healthy Portland that are happening throughout the Bureau. Kenya's team has created a racial equity lens and empowerment tool, which we showed you at a past board meeting. The team has been conducting a series of trainings to help staff understand how to use the tool and to help with tool refinement. The planning team has worked with our senior management team to identify and summarize the Bureau's current guiding plans. The finance, performance, and analysis team is working with a consultant to update our cost recovery policy. This team is also rethinking performance management in the Bureau and has conducted a performance metric audit that will help us as we align Bureau budgets, strategies, and actions and results. We've been coordinating internal services to support summer 2021 programs and the organizational ramp that ultimately will support additional levy funding services for the community, and of course, so much more. Let's also remember that we're still adjusting our operations and services due to the continued evolution of COVID-19. It's been a very hectic and stressful year for all of us, but we're really excited by the opportunity to improve services for those in the community who need us the most. I'm really proud of my team for the amazing work they're doing. Okay, I'm going to turn it over to Stephanie Joya to talk a bit about our Portland Parks and Recreation community graphic and changes that we've made to it. Stephanie?
Hello, nice to see you all again. Good to be back. All right, so what you see on the screen here is the community diagram that we showed you at the May 27th work session, which all of you gave feedback on. And so we wanted to loop back with you and show you how we've incorporated your feedback. So the key things we heard from you were that it was too hard to read, the font was too small, and so we've simplified it quite a bit. You weren't, oh, keep it on the old one, please, Nicola. Thank you. You weren't immediately clear what you were looking at. Like, is this a description of our services or is this a stakeholder map? What's the purpose of it? So we've removed anything that isn't specific to identifying our stakeholders. It wasn't clear where park staff show up, and it was just in general kind of the feedback we heard is sort of like overwhelming and like too much to absorb at once. So we fixed that by making it a build. So I'd like to walk you through it again now, like as if for the first time, to test whether we've improved that experience. And we're going to be using this document in our community engagement sessions. So what we love about your feedback is that you offer us really great feedback on like whether our messages are landing, and we really appreciate the feedback you gave us last time, and so this is really helpful. And also hopefully this is good information for our newest board members as well. So let's try it. All right, so this is our new community diagram. It represents the relationships we believe will support a thriving parks and recreation experience for all Portlanders, and represents a shift in how we think about those relationships. We created it to clearly see who Portland Parks and Recreation stakeholders are, and to guide our Healthy Parks, Healthy Portland community engagement and co-design process. So let's start with the largest and most central stakeholder in blue. This is our community. We will work across a wide range of community partnerships to center the voices of underserved communities. So specifically Black people, Indigenous people, people of color, immigrants and refugees, LGBTQIA+ people, youth, older adults, people living with disability, and people living with low income. And to ensure that Portland Parks and Recreation is connected with these communities, we will engage in a growing number of community partnerships, like community-based organizations and culturally specific partners. Currently, we have partnerships with the Native American Community Advisory Council, Coalition of Communities of Color, Parks Advisory Committee, Home Forward, immigrant and refugee leaders, and are actively growing our network. And Melissa's going to talk about that next. Our community includes volunteers that help maintain and enhance green spaces, as well as Portland's neighborhood network. So overall, this is a shift. In the past, our engagement efforts simply weren't inclusive or expansive enough. In recent years, we've worked to remedy this in engagement efforts around capital projects, but we recognize that this work has remained undersupported on a broad scale. So by intentionally centering the perspectives and needs of underserved community members, we are committing to do the work of explicitly decentering the perspectives of those who have held disproportionate power and privilege. All right, let's talk about the green layer. So the green layer represents stakeholders in delivering parks and recreation experiences in Portland. Our bureau, Portland Parks and Rec, is a big part of this, but not the only player. So included on this green sign are our staff. The parkies are a key stakeholder representing full-time and seasonal staff who bring parks and recreation experiences to life. And within this group, we consider all staff, leadership, as well as giving weight to our Diversity and Equity Committee, Fostering Equitable Support Team, and the Equity and Inclusion Team. So as I said earlier, Portland Parks and Rec is not the only player in delivering public parks and recreation experiences in Portland. We also work with institutional partners like the Japanese Gardens, the Oregon Zoo, the Audubon Society. We work with service providers like recreational soccer leagues and Portland Public Schools, whose playgrounds are part of the fabric of our city parks. A different way to look at the community we serve is not just through that blue identity lens, but through these white boxes, the way that folks choose to engage with our parks and recreation system. So park visitors, program participants, permittees, community center users, volunteers, community members. So when we engage with community stakeholders, we will use all channels to ensure we understand the needs of current and potential users. Let's look at the orange. So these are the other ways that community is represented in our city: our elected officials in city and regional government, the Parks Board. Urban Forestry Commission, and various standing advisory committees that bring ongoing community perspective to specific challenges like accessibility or park design. So taking the whole picture together, the goal of Healthy Parks, Healthy Portland framework is to work together across these stakeholders to create solutions and engage in collaborative decision-making. We recognize that this is aspirational and doesn't reflect our history of giving weight to groups with historic power and influence. And we know we have a legacy to repair there. We're committed to building trust through two-way communication, shared goals, and building a history of promises kept. End scene. So that's the, based on your feedback, how we've made some revisions to the way we're telling the story and presenting the story and the way we want to do that with community. So we wanted to pause here and have a little bit of a discussion with you about just your feedback on how we've made changes to that since we last met. Also, any kind of questions as well would be welcome.
Well, I'll start by saying it's a nice improvement. I think it communicates much more effectively than the original graphic did, and breaking it out into pieces really helps that. So I'll start there and let others chime in.
Thanks, Paul.
No, I'll second that, Paul. It's much more legible at this scale as well. So I think it's going to translate very well to different media.
Thank you, David.
Well, I wasn't involved. I'm new to the board, so I might be missing some context, but I did have a question about specifically under centering the voices of underserved communities, where you have youth and older adults. I completely see that as an important audience to be reaching with our park services. I haven't in the past seen that those groups as a general group put into a category of underserved communities. So, and I can do this offline, but I would love to get some understanding of how how these groups were put into that segment. Just because when I think about if you prioritize all youth, and that's one of the lenses that you're looking this through, there's certainly many youth who are not actually underserved in our park system. And so I just would love to understand that more. I don't think it's a graphic feedback thing, but I would love to be able to gain that knowledge about how those categories were selected for that area.
I can jump in real quick and then we can probably expound on it in another forum. But I think this was more about underserved youth and underserved older adults, right?
Okay.
Not youth in general and not
Understood.
older
Okay.
adult, right? So we recognize that there are youth who we are not reaching, and there are certainly older adults that we are not reaching, and we want to make sure that we are reaching them, that we are lowering or minimizing, eliminating barriers to them having access and being able to benefit from our services.
I see. That makes sense to me. Thank you.
Sure.
Yeah, I'll just comment. I really like the diagram. I think it expresses what you're saying you intend to express. My only just very quick thought is why not put the underserved communities in the center of the diagram and have, the governance and Portland Parks and Rec at the ends with just a circle representing their communication. So you would remove the arrows that are directly between governance and Portland Parks, have them at each end of the circle, with the arrows going around the circle, but the community truly in this visual center.
Okay, yeah, so I'm hearing that that community doesn't feel centered to you in the visual. Okay, yeah, thank you for that. Casey, I saw your hand.
Thank you. And I do like this better than the last one. Thank you so much for doing this. And this is kind of along with Adrian's statement. And it looks at the arrows at the bottom with governance going up. And then you see the arrows on the sides where you've got the underserved communities seeming to go around the sides. So if you look at just the arrows, it doesn't look like there's any direct conversations between the Portland Parks level and the underserved communities. and I might just be missing it, but maybe double arrows between those two tiers.
Okay. Yeah, I see what you're saying. Yeah, I think what we wanted to show was that direct contact is not the only way that we get the voice of underserved communities, that we also do that through our advisory groups. So we wanted to show that it's happening both places, but I see how that might not be clear. Yeah, and I, it's interesting, Adrian, your point, we've tried this a couple different ways, and we've tried, we did try having the communities visually in the center, but what we found was that most people still read top to bottom. So we wanted the first thing we talk about to be those communities. So that is kind of a little bit of the story of how we ended up with it in this order. But we tried to just give it plenty of real estate and have it be the first thing. But yeah, no, I think that's all really great feedback. Sabrina.
Thanks. I'm a new board member as well, so this is my first time seeing it, and I don't so much have a question about the visual, but more so like the substance of it. So it talks about centering the voices of underserved communities. I thought I heard someone say like in decision making and stuff like that. But then it talks about how city and regional government, parks board, and advisory committees are the governance and advising. So it seems, I don't know, when I read it, it seems like it's contradictory. Like how are we centering voices if these are the three bodies? And I know there's multiple advisory commissions and committees that it says are the ones that are advising the Portland Parks and Recreation.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think Melissa will speak a little bit to this as well. I think one thing that, so this particular graphic is really about the who, and then we have a separate one around like how listening and learning works. That's much more about the how, because there's a huge amount of direct engagement with those community partnerships. And it's definitely not all coming through the governance and advising. And in fact, the governance and advising is, in terms of approach, actually like a much smaller part of the listening. But yeah, so I'm definitely hearing that comes through both in the way we're communicating it, and I think the thing that we wanted to be clear about is that these governance and advising groups also have an obligation to be centering the voices of underserved communities. And it's not just Parks and Rec that is doing that on our own, that we are expecting our other partners to be doing that as well. But I think actually, Sabrina, I think some of your questions might be in terms of like how, or will be addressed by Melissa in what she's going to share next.
Okay, I guess, yeah, I appreciate that, and I'll look forward to that as well. But when I do look at the visual, and this is my first time seeing it again, so this might just be more confusing than helpful. But when I do read like we center the voices, but then I see governance and advising is coming from these groups, it reads contradictory to me. So I don't necessarily have a suggestion going forward, but maybe just kind of food for thought.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that is very helpful. Thank you.
Thank you.
All right, well, thank you guys for your feedback last round that got us to this point, and your feedback again today. It's really, really valuable, and we really appreciate it. So I'm going to hand it over now to Melissa to kind of move from the who to the how.
Hello, thanks so much, Stephanie. Hi, Parks Board. So I've got a fair amount of content that I'm going to work my way through, but I'm going to be sure to leave a lot of time for discussion and questions once I've kind of gotten through the information. Hopefully this will answer some of the questions, but I imagine that there will be more. So we'll pause for a moment when we get to certain parts that are interesting to you. what I mean is that we can go back to slides and pull them back up at the end if needed. So, okay, so as many of you now know, we are committing to and moving forward into a wide-ranging community engagement process represented by this graphic, represented on this graphic by 2 waves of co-design. And Sabrina, this gets at some of what you were asking. So we are kickstarting this conversation by doing what we're referring to as a listening and learning process and paving the way forward. So as a reminder, the blue stripe at the top of the image includes reference to culturally specific providers, community-based organizations, and the people they serve. It also includes our Parks Board, you all, and our Parks Commissioner's Office. Although today's focus is discussing our engagement plans and primarily the first wave, I just really want to underscore how we're not starting today. We're basing our work on what we've already heard from community. Iterative, responsive, inclusive, and equity-focused engagement is how we will support the next era of parks and recreation work. So you'll see a nod to that in the graphic at the top right. This is sort of a cutout of what we view as the past and the future. Okay, so many of you have been in some of our earliest engagements around Healthy Parks, Healthy Portland. Thank you so much. We sincerely appreciate the insight and expertise that you've offered. I think that visual that we just saw of the community diagram is a great example of how we're working to incorporate that. We're going to be excited to circle back in the near future with draft documents and tools. As you can see here, we've had a number of workshops and conversations with stakeholders already. We've worked with our diverse and knowledgeable staff. We've met with our Parks Accessibility Advisory Committee and have connected with our Urban Forestry Commission as well. As far as next steps go, as you know, we're leading with racial equity and centering the voices of Portlanders who have been underserved. So we're currently working to schedule with a few different organizations and groups that we feel can support our connection with people who don't currently feel safe, welcome, or well served by our parks and recreation system. The level of engagement we're able to do will, of course, be based on these organization and neighbors' capacity and interests. Nonprofits, of course, have various pressures, especially during this time of year with the closeout of their fiscal years, staff vacations, graduations, and shifting COVID protocols. There's also robust engagement happening around other issues in our community, for instance, affordable housing and the supportive housing services measure deployment. So we know that we need to be aware of this and be especially strategic and respectful. We also know that we're going to need to support capacity for these organizations and offer financial and other support for community members who participate in this work. So that's a lot of what we're currently working on. We've reached out and are behind the scenes working to identify options for financially supporting the work. We're prioritizing in this first wave, connecting with leadership of these organizations to ensure that foundational aspects of our approach are solid. As we move forward, we'll connect with direct service staff and their served communities to ask for input that will help shape the tools and processes that you've heard about. So mission, vision, values, equity statement, a decision-making tool for supporting decisions that align with what we've heard from community, and the development of actions and results framework that takes into account what the community is asking for and needs. One group we've reached out to is the Native American Community Advisory Committee, NACAC, and I'm happy to report that we have a meeting with NACAC leadership scheduled for this coming Monday, and we're on the agenda for the broader NACAC meeting next Wednesday, June 16th. Another group that we've reached out to is Home Forward. Home Forward is the housing authority serving Multnomah County. It's an organization that provides affordable housing, supportive services, and rental assistance to over 15,000 households that align closely with the communities we're wanting to better connect with. We've been in contact with the leadership of their community services department, and they're really interested in working with us. I should note that I have rich relationships here because just a few months ago, I was one of the leaders of that same department. So I'm really hopeful that we're going to get a date on the calendar soon. We're kind of emailing back and forth right now. And we're going to have initial conversations with service coordination staff and then build that partnership over time. We're also working to reconvene some key leaders of immigrant and refugee communities here in Portland that came together last year in informations information sessions related to the levy referral. We know it's, of course, important to circle back, thank them for how their input helped shape initial levy priorities, and then support them in seeing how we're using that information moving forward. We'll chat through some of the Healthy Parks, Healthy Portland work, and then we will invite those who are interested to join us in future conversations. Another group we're working to convene is a group of former Parks Advisory Committee members from recent developments east of 122nd. Given their demonstrated interest in investment, as well as the representation of a geographic area we know we need to invest in, we believe we'll have fruitful co-design conversations. Our hope is to include staff from East Portland Parks Coalition and the Rosewood Initiative if they're available, and we're going to be reaching out in the coming days to connect around this. Lastly, before I open this up for discussion and questions, I'm really excited to share about a partnership we're working on that we believe will be a cornerstone of this effort in the way we move forward together. So for the past month, we've been in evolving conversations with the Coalition of Communities of Color. And for those of you who are less familiar with the work of the Coalition, they are an alliance of culturally specific community-based organizations that supports a collective racial justice effort to improve outcomes for communities of color. They do this through policy analysis and advocacy, environmental justice work, culturally appropriate data and research, and leadership development in communities of color. Their membership is comprised of organizations many of you are likely familiar with, ERCO, Verde, PCRI, APANO, to name a few. We've been able to establish that the coalition's really interested in working with us, and they're excited about building out how we do that together. We really see this emerging relationship as central to our approach and view our future work together in two broad areas. The short-term engagement work around Healthy Parks, Healthy Portland foundational tools and systems, and the long-term work of supporting ongoing accountability to community. So this may be a research partnership, a capacity building grant making partnership, or a combination of several approaches. In alignment with our principles, we're approaching this through the lens of collaborative design. So we don't quite know what we'll end up with because it's important that we work on that together. Okay, I've talked quite a bit and I want to make sure that we're able to have a discussion and then we can begin to answer some questions. So I'll stop here and ask if anyone has any thoughts or questions.
Well, I'll ask a question while other people think about their questions. So, Melissa, you described the process as being iterative, inclusive, and responsive. Could you tell us a little bit more about how those pieces link together, and particularly the responsive part of it?
Sure thing. So you know what, actually, Nicola, would you mind pulling up that community listening and learning process graphic again? Okay, so this is a really simplified version of this graphic. We've developed a much more built out version that has timelines at the bottom for various tool development, but it's a lot to look at in one page. So what you're going to see is just kind of referring back to, we're talking primarily about wave one today. And you see those touch points at the top. Those are various touch points with community groups, and at the bottom with parkies. We have this green stripe in the middle with wiggly lines, and these wiggly lines are meant to represent a lot of work. So what we are doing is we're kind of going out to community, and in this first wave, we're kicking the tires of the process as a whole and asking, you know, does this process make sense? Do we think this is going to get us there? We're also asking about broad conceptual we're like, what does community need from us in sort of a really broad way? And so we're asking mission, vision, values questions. Those will help shape foundational aspects of how we move our work forward and how we make decisions in the future. And at the end of this wave, we're going to synthesize all of this information, and we're going to work on what we're talking about. So a decision-making tool is first and foremost, like one of the key things coming out of this. Like, we're hearing from community that these 5 things are important. This is how they want us to weight decisions. And so we're now going to develop a tool that helps us do that. And then we're going to run our decisions through that tool. So we'll build that in the squiggly line in the middle. And then we want to make sure that that's not it, right? So that iterative part is going back to community and saying, okay, this is what we heard, this is what we developed. Are we getting close to it? And then they can respond to that and let us know if we're getting close, if it was way off. Much in the same way that we, on a much smaller scale, just did that with our community graphic in this group. We plan to do that with some of these foundational aspects. And then, you know, although we're not talking much about the future, really the point of all of this is to lay the foundation for the future. The documents, the tools, all of this that we're developing is only so valuable in that we're building relationships through it, because those relationships are really the key. And so that's where I see our newly established commitment to iteration, is that we're building a foundation that we're hoping will help us with this cadence in an ongoing fashion, not just about this, but about other decisions that the Bureau makes in the future. That's a lot of me talking, but I feel like if the leadership of our organization would like to weigh in, this would be an opportunity.
I think you covered it really well, but I also like what Catherine put in the chat, and that was that responsive equals showing input incorporated and then closing the feedback loop. And I think that's a very succinct way to describe what we mean by being responsive.
Cool. All right. So we can leave this graphic up if it's helpful. Otherwise, if we like to look at each other, I generally like to, then we can do that. Thanks. All right. I see Dr. Corbin.
Hi, yes, thank you for this. My question is in regard to how is the code of design actually going to be implemented as far as a universal design language? Are we going to have, you know, how are you planning to hear the community through language and making it legible and making sure there's interpreters or, you know, American Sign Language on board? So how are you thinking through that process? Will the onus be on these community organizations, or is it going to be in another, is it going to be centered in another place?
Excellent question. So the team that I work with, community engagement within Parks, is committed to accessibility and committed to getting better at accessibility. That's the primary focus. And so a lot of our initial conversations around this work is how can we ensure that the language we're using is not just good in its sort of English format on a document that we throw up on a screen, but how can we make sure that that's translatable, interpretable? How can we ensure that we have tools like alt text, screen readers, adaptability? How can we be inclusive in every aspect? And some of that inclusivity is also cultural in nature. And that's why from the first conversation, we knew that not just connecting with the coalition or other organizations on the front end about the content of the questions, but how do we ask these questions? What do you see as needs from the community? So I think that that's at the forefront, and some of that we're learning in our initial conversations. So, you know, hearing these questions raised has given us a shape of what we need to be paying attention to, and that's part of sort of building the plane as we fly it. Is we know we need to get better. We know that it's not something that we've historically always done great at, and so we need to hear this feedback on the front end. So one group that we'll work with is the CELs, Community Engagement Liaisons, for interpretation and translation services, particularly for groups of individuals. And when it comes to those organizational partners, we're going to speak with those organizational partners about what works for them and what works for their communities. And so if that means that we find interpretation services or translation services or ASL, or that's something that we'll negotiate. We're really trying to live our principles and collaboration, and not just approach our partners with a canned idea of what we want to do and ask them to fit into the box that we're trying to, you know, fit them into. We really want to kind of come to them with sort of our idea and say, how would this work for you? So I don't know if that answers all of your question, but as always, my colleagues are welcome to jump in.
Yeah, I'll jump in just for a second. Thank you for the question, Dr. Corbin. This is critical. Like if we cannot make this information accessible, and if we can't have that two-way dialogue, then we're not going to get to where we need to. So, what the diagram, the last graphic was showing was the first two initial waves. This is an ongoing process. So beyond this year, we're going to continue to learn and adapt, and we're going to get better at this as we move forward. So what you're seeing now, where we're at in a year, it may look very, very different, but it is a core goal to make sure that as we're having these conversations, that they are accessible.
I would like to also caution that for some communities that if they're not brought in initially, they will interpret it as it not being for them. So as soon as they can be included from the beginning, then they can actually take ownership and move through this process versus added on later. Just something to consider.
Absolutely. Another great point, Dr. Corbin, and a huge reason why we are working with the Commissioner's Office to have early engagement with Coalition of Community Color, from the leadership level of the Alliance organizations to the line staff to the folks that they're serving, to make sure that what we're building is going to make sense, so that the outcomes are what we're hoping for, and that we're not creating more harm as we move through this process.
Thank you so much. Excellent questions and comments. I believe Nova or Adrian, I don't know who was first. Nova, how about you?
Thank you. My question is somewhat related to the questions that have been being raised, but having been involved with Portland Public Schools, listening feedback sessions, and also hearing the concerns of parents. And I think this is a really thoughtful process that you are talking through, but what is I think there's the one thing to have the overall framework about how to approach it, and also the timing and the process and all of that. But what do you feel is different about how are we closing the gap on the skepticism that community members feel about engaging in these processes? I think that, I'd say for the last 10 years, I've been hearing, when I'm engaged in community processes, the idea that it's going to be different, and I'm not being negative. I think I'm just trying to put forward the high skepticism that seems to be out in our community around what is done when there's feedback, and how done processes are. And I think that the graphics and how you've described the process sounds like you've been very thoughtful about that. But I think my question is really, what is the difference? How is that gap being closed around skepticism?
Oh, that's such a good question. I'll take a quick jump at this, and then Tim, I saw you on mute, so I think you have some ideas. I think that, if I can be authentic in this moment, I think it takes time, honestly. Trust is something that you build over time. You don't come with a package and say, okay, I'm going to buy your trust with these 3 actions. I think that our partners are going to hopefully see over time that we're living these principles and appropriately centering. And I think that transparency is the other aspect. When we don't get something right, I think we've got to name it. I hope my leadership in this call are good with that. And when we are able to successfully incorporate feedback or not, I think that that's the clarity that oftentimes is lacking. We've had a lot of conversations in the context of building this, where kind of this idea that we need to be real with people about what we can and cannot change in these conversations on the front end, so that there's not these pie in the sky conversations that people don't feel connect with reality. And so we're trying to figure out how to do that. So those are my initial thoughts, but Tim, I'm happy to have you jump in.
Yeah, I don't need to say much beyond that, Melissa. That was a great response. And I think that it's true. We just need to show that we are listening. What are we doing with that information? How is it impacting our decisions about resource allocation, program and policy development? And then putting that back out there to the community and communicating it, and then going back through that cyclical process again, and being able to show where the input is coming in, how it is helping us make better decisions, and how it is impacting the communities in a positive way that we want to center.
Yeah, and I'll note in the chat, Stephanie Joya, who's joining us, she noted that she thinks that there's a really unique opportunity around the levy funding that feels like a new rallying point. And I couldn't agree more that it affords us the opportunity to put real resource and intention behind this in a way that I think we haven't been able to in the past, and some organizations aren't able to in the at this current moment. And so we're taking it and we're trying to pave the way with that. Okay, Adrian, thank you for your patience.
Yeah, I think we're all talking about the same thing, which is engaging communities, getting them to trust and having them feel heard. And I was at the Urban Forestry Commission. I happen to be on the Urban Forestry Commission when you came and talked to us about it, collected information, and really nifty online tool that you have to collect what it is mostly quantitative data. And so just I've done this kind of work professionally that you're doing now in public health. And so just some questions about the methods that you're using, and to what extent are you having, at least early on, very open-ended questions, so you really know what your questionnaire should look like, and also to have people feel heard. When we walked away from Urban Forestry Commission, it was sort of like, well, wait a minute, the word tree was not in the questionnaire. So anyway, if you could comment on that, that would be good.
Yeah, I'd be happy to. So hold on one second. Yeah. Sorry, my dogs just made a surprise appearance in my office, so took my attention. So as far as our methods, we have one thing that we're doing is we're always having note takers as part of these conversations, and we don't necessarily announce that ahead of time, but folks are taking notes about the comments made in the conversation, in addition to the quantitative tools. As you saw that, and as some of you will see in the future, the Menti tool, there are some open-ended or qualitative questions built in there. So we're getting some of that feedback on a broader scale as well. We're also taking transcripts. One of the benefits of the virtual realm is that we can turn on the transcript feature and download that after the fact, and we can pull out comments that we might have missed in our notes. So we're making sure to, where possible, to code those in our sort of framework that we're developing to handle this data, because it's an overwhelming amount of data that we're pulling, and we want to make sure that we're using it well. So I will, Catherine's on this phone or on this little chat. And Catherine, I'm wondering, is there anything that you want to note about how we're approaching this that I haven't touched on?
No, I just think that we've been very, very mindful around trying to balance open-ended, broad questions with also trying to gather comparative data based on listening that we've been doing to date. So we don't want to come to the conversation as if we know nothing right now, because we have been having conversations and doing listening. So where we can get quantitative data to validate what we think we've heard in the past, that's great. But we also want to make sure that there are spaces for open-ended questions and storytelling. And I think the Menti tool, you'll all get to see in a moment, because we're going to have you use it for just a couple questions in this meeting today. But some of the reasons that I think it's really effective with large groups is that it creates an opportunity for everybody to provide feedback and see one another's feedback in the same moment. So with a large group, it can be really helpful. With a group of 8 or 9, where maybe you get a couple people that dominate the conversation, Menti allows everybody to participate and for everybody to see everybody else's participation in a nice way. I don't think we'll be using Menti for some community groups, and especially very small groups. So if we only have a group of 4 or 5 people, we probably will not use Menti. We'll just have a discussion and take notes.
Yeah, for example, on Monday with NACAC leadership, I'm not going to be using the Menti tool. I'm going to be having a discussion. Okay, so I know that we're coming short on time. I love this stuff, so I could chat with you all day. But Dr. Corbin, is there anything you'd like to add before we close out this part of our agenda?
Yeah, I was wondering, how are you going to combat participation fatigue from community members? And are there phases in place so communities can actually see the results of the time and effort that they put in? I find that to be one of the hardest things, this sort of longitudinal, cyclical participation for community members.
Yeah, I think that that's one of our biggest challenges that we're going to face. And as I noted in sort of my my dumping of information at the beginning of my chat, we know that we're not the only game in town, and many community members are being engaged with many times by many different jurisdictional partners and organizations. And so I think that that's something that we're going to have to be especially aware of. And I think that one of the ways that we're committed to supporting folks' participation financially, and we know that that's not the be all end all. That doesn't that's not the reason why folks are likely to come. But I'm hoping that that will help folks see that we value their time and expertise. And feeling valued, I think, is an aspect of that burnout that folks experience. The other part is not feeling either heard or understood, or frankly believed. I think that believing people and moving forward on that belief that that you experience is really key here. And I think that, you know, as we noted, you know, during this first process, we're hoping to come back with draft tools and documents in short order. It's a few months later, which is pretty rare in government, where you get to see the result of your input just a couple of months later. My hope is that that starts to build the foundation of trust that will combat that burnout. But yeah, so again, I'll open it up to other colleagues of mine that want to share.
So it's another great question, Dr. Corbin. Thank you so much. I think the Coalition of Communities of Color is really going to help us through this partnership. That alliance is, you know, we are a very white community, and folks of color throughout the state and throughout the metro area are overburdened at this point, not just from government agencies looking for input, but private sector, nonprofit, others. And so we're going to work with the coalition to make sure we're working at a pace that makes sense, and then making sure that we are using resources from the levy, where we distinctly told the community that we needed to build stronger community partnerships, to make sure that we are investing in the capacity building of those partner organizations so that they are able to do the work they're currently doing, but also can use that capacity to engage their interest in working with Portland Parks around this work. So something we're taking very seriously, and something that a key partner is going to support us with.
Yeah, and thank you so much, because that's, I think, as Tim mentioned, that's a valuable point. Okay, and again, I could chat about this all day. It's literally my job, and so I love it. But I am excited to hand it over to Catherine to walk us through some additional stuff. Catherine?
All right, thank you. Yeah, so last time when we met, we kind of gave an overview of the process and approach, and then we also asked you some questions which we would be asking to community and our other key stakeholders around mission, vision, and values input. There are 2 questions that we did not get to. We did not have time, so would love to have that discussion around those questions with you today, and invite you to use the Menti tool in order to do so. I'm going to post a link to the Menti and the specific code that you're going to type in into the chat. And I'm also going to share my screen. So somebody give me some thumbs up if you are seeing my screen. Okay, cool. So what you'll see on my screen is the answers that people begin to put in for these questions, but you'll need your own browser window with this website and the code put in order to be able to input your answers. So we have 2 questions that we did not get to in our last meeting, and they're really around bringing to life what an equitable park system might look like for Portland Parks. And we're going to ask it in two parts. The first question is, what are some specific examples of what an equitable park system should be like in the short term? And then the second question that we're going to ask you is for some specific examples of what that might look like in the long term. So when we say we are committed to creating an equitable park system, in your mind, what does success look like? What is the evidence or the things that you can see and witness around what that might look like? If anybody is having difficulty getting to the Menti, you can either kind of just raise your hand, chime in, put something in the chat, and we'll try to support you. You should have the ability to put in more than one example. You can put in as many as come to mind. Okay, I see 31 entries. I think we've got probably like 12 to 13 people perhaps participating. So we're kind of, everyone's got a couple of things in there. I'm going to give just kind of another minute. I can still see some thinking faces, so I'm going to let you still continue to think and add, and then we'll spend a minute talking through them. I'm just gonna kind of start at the top and scroll through them so you can kind of read through them. Definitely seeing some themes here around access to both kind of the parks itself, access to similar features at the park, and access to tree canopy and tree cover along city streets. access to programs. Saw another big theme around kind of safety and accessibility. Aspects that make parks welcoming for multiple cultures. This comment around continuous parks, green space, connection between the parks. Is whoever kind of put that comment, are you willing to speak to that a little bit?
Are you saying, I put that comment, did you want me to speak about it?
Sure, yeah.
Sure. Yeah, I think it's an opportunity. I mean, working with our urban forestry division and Portland Parks and Rec, I think we have an opportunity to enlarge our parks by having these mini parks and connections between parks so that you could have just longer distances and more places where you could be forest bathing.
Great, thank you. Few more comments here around ADA accessibility and a consistent kind of level of service and quality of programs. Okay, I'm gonna flip to the next question here. I recognize we just have kind of, about 6 minutes left. So I want you to be thinking a little longer term. What are some examples of what an equitable park system should be like in the long term? So further out, think a little bigger, reach a little higher. What might that look like? And you should see that this question has refreshed on your browser window as well. It'll say the presenter has refreshed this, go to slide. You have to click a button. Yeah, this is an interesting comment. It's not just about the access of the services and experiences, but also about the trust being built between parks and marginalized communities long term. Great. Okay. I'm going to kind of scroll back again from the top here. I'm going to give you kind of another opportunity to kind of read through. We're going to leave this question open, so you can feel free to spend another minute or two or 5 or 6 after the meeting answering it, should you like. And we will export all the results and make that available for all of you to read after the meeting as well. Director Long, I will, as people are kind of, I'll leave this screen up and let people scroll through, but if you want to start maybe speaking to kind of next steps or some closing thoughts, you can do so.
Thank you so much, Catherine and Stephanie. I want to thank the whole board for taking time during your retreat to share additional input on the front end of our planning process, and as well as letting us know some examples of what an equitable park system will look like to you. We'll continue to provide you with updates on our progress at your regular board meetings. And again, we'll be doing sort of a little overview for the new board members at their upcoming orientations. And we look forward to coming back to you in wave 2 for additional feedback. So again, we appreciate all that you do for Parks and Recreation now and in the future. So I'm really excited and proud of the work that we're going to be doing together. Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.
All right, thank you, Adina and team. That was a good presentation, and we'll see where that next wave takes us. We definitely hit on some of the themes that came up as we were sharing about parks. You know, I heard about affordability and children and safety. So there's a lot of correlation here between what has brought us to be on this board together and what we're trying to do for our communities across Portland. So the topic that we skipped over earlier was, how do we work together? So I just want to share my screen briefly in terms of sharing our mission statement. Okay, that's not it. One sec. Everyone see that? Great. So we have this very long sentence that describes our purpose, but essentially, as a result of the Vision 2020 plan, which is essentially the precursor to what we're doing now with Healthy Parks, Healthy Portland, the Portland Parks Board was defined to help guide that process. So we're at a similar point 20 years down the road. And I'm not going to read this to you because it's really long and all of you can read it on your own, but we're an advisory board, and that's our mission. And we are doing our work through the lens of racial equity. We're trying to atone for institutional racism over a long history here in Portland that has made for inequities across our park system, as well as other civic services across the city. So we meet as a board once a month. That's our mandate, and we have 15 full members and up to 4 ex officio members. Currently, Randy and Lorena are our ex officio members from the Parks Foundation and from the Urban Forestry Board. Our terms are 2 successive 3-year terms, and we are actually considered public officials, which means that the Oregon government ethics law applies to us. So that's something to take a look at and familiarize ourselves with. What's expected, sort of the basics, are that we attend our meetings. Everyone gets pulled in different directions. So when there's times when there is a conflict, please contact Brooke, and also copy the chair and vice chair, just so people can know. It helps in terms of planning for our meetings to know who's going to be there, who's not going to be there. And because we are a public body, our meetings need to conform with the Oregon Public Meetings Law. So that means that whenever we have a quorum, whether it's I won't go down that path yet, but when we meet, we have to take notes, and it's an open meeting, people can attend. So we just have to be in good behavior with the public and between ourselves. And that brings me around to, we're a diverse group, and we all come with this intention of wanting to help Portland Parks and Recreation be the best version of itself. We all come with very different frames of, some of us grew up without parks being close by, others did, but we all have a common commitment to parks. And so we're going to see some things differently. And that's, just based on who we are and where we've come from. And just to treat each other with that understanding that we come with the best of intentions. We may make mistakes. We may say things that unintentionally are offensive. And if so, as was pointed out in the chat earlier, if we make a mistake, let's just clean it up as soon as we can and be honest and genuine with each other. I don't want to say a whole lot more at this time because I want to leave time for our sort of closeout with the working group introductions. But are there any basic questions that I can answer for especially new board members, but anything else that I might be able to clarify for the board today? Okay, well, I'll take that at face value that we are clear about those parts. So the next part of our agenda is for there to be a high-level overview of our 3 working groups. So we have a financial sustainability working group, we have a community engagement working group, and we have a land use and infrastructure working group. So we're going to start with Aaron, who's going to be presenting for the community engagement working group.
Do we want to stop the screen share maybe?
Oh, yes, of course. Sorry.
No problem. Hi, everybody. I'm Erin. I think I've actually met all of you since I was in chair of the nominating committee for the newer members, of course. I think that my thing will be a little bit for the newer members, since a lot of the existing members are somewhat familiar with that. So the community engagement working group is a working group that's been around a few years, and for the time I've been on the board, which is about 2 years, it hasn't necessarily been meeting regularly, and for some of that time didn't have staff support available to it. And it's a group, I'm very excited for people that want to join this group. I just recently really started leading it, and we're in a process of being strategic, envisioning what this is going to be. And community engagement is not my area of expertise. I'd love for people where this is a passion of theirs, for them to be involved in this and to, maybe eventually take it over as well. I do think that some of the things that will follow under the work of the group is something I've been working on. And most recently, me, Bonnie, and Casey have been working on looking at our public comment procedure and being, I guess, rethinking that somewhat, both to encourage, look at what's the process that people go through public comment, who has access to public comment, who kind of gets to the board level, versus maybe who do we need to be hearing from as a board, and do we invite them here, or what are the opportunities for us to go to who might, actually would make sense for us to be communicating with, getting out in the community. So public comment, and then engagement and going out to communities being one of our goals as a board over the past few years has also been to increase our visibility. I think that'll probably fall under public or community engagement. And I also think there's often opportunities that arise to serve on other kinds of advisory groups, like I'm serving on the Mill Park Public Advisory Committee. I think having community engagement, members from that group, our group, be involved in those other groups as well, and be a kind of conduit for communicating information that would make sense to the board. I'm hoping to get community engagement to a place with your help where we are connected to different communities in Portland, but with an emphasis on communities that have been historically underserved, communities, you know, BIPOC communities, East Portland, et cetera. So, and I need help to do that as, you know, as a board. That's a little update. It's not a great update. I didn't prepare anything. I apologize in advance. But I hope that that gives you a little bit of background and information on the group and where I'm hoping we can go. Any questions?
No need to apologize, Erin. That was a good high-level overview. So
It's a little hard because we haven't really been up and running. So I want the people that want to do this work to come with me and figure it out. I can't necessarily tell you what we're going to be doing because we need to figure this out together. And I'm looking forward to partners who are ready to come help me figure out, not help me, help the board figure out what this working group can do to fulfill our mission, you know, so.
okay, let's move to financial sustainability, and Mike Elliott will lead us on that.
Great. Thanks, Paul, and hello, everybody, and welcome to all the new board members. The Financial Sustainability Working Group, the name is pretty descriptive of what we do. We kind of serve as a conduit between our full Parks Board and the Parks Finance and senior staff. So Bureau staff provides us with monthly updates on a variety of financial topics, which we would then report back to the board. A big part of this is the annual parks budget, which includes adjustments that happen in the spring and the fall. It's called the spring and fall bump, which stands for budget monitoring process. You're going to hear a lot of acronyms that you will learn over time, and don't ever be afraid to ask about them. It also deals with ongoing operations and maintenance funding, as well as cost recovery. And then we also participate in conversations related to systems development charges, new levy and bond issuances, and other sustainable future activities. And sustainable future is another term that you're going to be hearing a lot as we move forward. Members of the group typically participate for budget advisory committee and some other finance related committees, which come up now and then. An example of that is we just heard about the decision-making team that's part of Healthy Parks, Healthy Portland. Casey, who's in our working group, is participating in that team. So there's opportunities like that that pop up now and then. And then one thing I'll just add, and I think this applies to all the working groups, not just the financial sustainability, is that we have no authority to make any decisions on behalf of the board. So what we're doing is we're providing information back to the board to help the board make decisions. So that's what I have. Any questions? Thanks.
Thanks, Mike. And Patty Tillett's going to present for the Land Use and Infrastructure Working Group.
Thank you, Paul. Well, as you can imagine, in a city the size of Portland, there are constant changes going on in land use and infrastructure. And what the working group does is research really on two levels. On one level, it's to keep our ears open as to what's going on and figure out what may or may not be of relevance to the board's work. And for those topics that are relevant to the board's work, we do a bit more research to find out exactly what's going on, and then can bring back to the full board a concise summary of what's going on. So the sorts of things that we have looked at have been the master plan for the South Park blocks, for example, which was published very recently, looking at how that might impinge on other works of the Parks Board. We keep track of other things such as a plan for the south reach of the Willamette, where there were a lot of land use changes. Not many of them impinged directly on the work of the parks, but some did. So it was a matter of filtering out that which is relevant and that which is not. So the work group really does that work and then brings back something, as I say, a concise statement to the board for a broader discussion. And sometimes we go away and find more information, bring that back as instructed, but it's just to be intelligent about how to deal with a great deal of information out there and be selective as to what we pursue. And that's pretty much what we do.
Thank you, Patty. So some of you may be asking yourselves, well, why did we do these presentations? Well, we wanted to give you an overview because tomorrow, as part of our retreat agenda, we'll be breaking out into 3 different working groups, and we've assigned people based largely on their wishes who've been polled and others who've been on the board, mostly along their current assignments. But in order to sort of balance the groups in terms of numbers, made a few switches. And the purpose of our breakout sessions is to identify topics of interest to pursue in the coming year. And we'll narrow those down. So we'll start out with a very wide net and see what people's thoughts are. And then there'll be a group exercise to identify priorities. And that will be a starting point for us going forward. The leaders of the groups will have a framework that includes some priorities that were identified in the 2019 retreat. That'll be a starting point, but it's just that, a starting point to get some ideas flowing in terms of what we want to take on. And probably doing less better is probably the mantra that we want to take here, which is one that I've borrowed from Adina. It's just, I think in many ways more satisfying to accomplish a few things well than set out with a really ambitious agenda and not really feel like we've accomplished much of those. So that would be my general instruction to all of us, is just to kind of keep it simple. Are there any questions as we move towards wrapping up? Okay, either we've all frozen up or we have a very, very quiet board today.
I have a question. How much do each of the working groups interact with staff to be able to get additional context and just be more informed?
Good question. So as it stands now, all the working groups will have staff that will attend the monthly working meetings, which typically precede our board meeting. So our board meeting is the second Tuesday of the month. So typically the working groups meet in either the previous week or just before we meet. So there is direct contact between the working groups and staff. Any other questions? All right. Well, thank you. We're ending right on time today. We look forward to rejoining tomorrow at 1 o'clock, and I look forward to it. Thank you very much. Have a good evening, and we'll see you tomorrow at 1 o'clock.
Thank you.
And just remember, there's a separate invite for tomorrow's meeting.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thanks, everyone.